Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 6 Elites. Fighting against high-level creatures was really risky. A single mistake was enough to send anyone on their way into the underworld and pay a greeting to the legendary god of death. In fact, even fighting a level 3 zombie during the first few minutes of the apocalypse was extremely difficult. One touch, the slightest scratch, and it would all be over right then and there. It didn't take a bite or too much contact for a life to end. In truth, if it weren't for Xieitain's luck, he would probably be dead by now. At that time, because the window of his room was small, the level 5 Big B had no choice but to fly directly that way, which made it much simpler for Xietain to attack it since he knew where the assault would come from. Otherwise, it was impossible for him to defeat such a fast and unpredictable monster. It was also thanks to that single kill that he obtained his skill blood manipulation. If it wasn't for this skill, Xietain wouldn't even have been able to leave his room successfully and would have become zombie food by now. However, although fighting high-level monsters was risky, the rewards of being victorious were far superior to the rewards one would get from defeating monsters at the same level. Just the extra stat points alone were equivalent to 2 or more levels, considering the fact that each person only got 2 stat points per level. Not to mention the drops. Xietain took a step forward and quickly put both orbs and the scroll into his backpack before standing up again. Immediately and without even a moment's rest, he stomped hard on the ground beneath his feet and charged towards the zombies staggering in his direction. A minute later, the remaining zombies had been purged by Xietain. Teacher Jia. What happened to everyone else? Xietain asked with a frown as he looked at a female teacher in her 30s that he had rescued earlier. Student Bai. The rest. I'm afraid they ran away when they saw things were getting ugly. As for the direction. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I don't know. The teacher replied with a bitter smile. This teacher's name was Jia Jiao, and she was a teacher of the third-year students, so she knew Xietain. Her personality was quite kind by nature, and in the past, she had treated Xietain quite well even though he came from an ordinary family. I see. Xietain simply nodded as he looked at the 12 people who remained. About half of them had fled upon seeing the zombies approaching from all directions. These people would most likely die unless they dared to fight for their lives, but even then, the chances of dying were much higher than living. As for this, Xietain could do nothing about it. Currently, it was already difficult for him to survive, and a single great fast mantis had forced him to use all the status points he had been saving for times of crisis. If he were to encounter 2 of those monsters, then Xietain would most likely die unless the battlefield conditions favored him greatly. Since those people fled, then they no longer had anything to do with him. He simply saved them earlier because he was just in passing and didn't want to see his kind become food for other species. Let's go. We need to move towards the gymnasium. Only then can we get some rest. He said and turned to leave. The 12 survivors followed him, not daring to stay behind. Their eyes filled with fear for the future, looked intently in all directions for dread that a strange mutated creature would take away the life they had been protecting for so many years. On the opposite side of the male dormitory was the female dormitory. The distance between the place where the girls rested and the gymnasium was exactly the same as the distance between the gymnasium and the male dormitory. A group of about 20 people moved in the direction of the gymnasium. This group of people was mainly composed of women, but there were also 7 men among them. However, no matter whether it was the women or the men, they all looked at the back of the woman who was leading them with respect, admiration, or love. A group of 5 zombies stumbled toward the crowd of survivors. Seeing their distorted expressions and their blank eyes, many of them could not help but shudder along with the small sound of choked sobs. The woman leading the group and carrying the lives of nearly 20 people on her shoulders had beautiful silver-colored hair and bright blue eyes. Her skin was as white as milk and as smooth as the purest silk, giving her an appearance similar to that of a real fairy. However, her expression was as cold as eternal ice, with no apparent emotional flow. Yet, although her expression was as cold as ice, her body was as hot as fire, filled with curves in the right places and extremely charming. Upon seeing the 5 zombies, this young woman of only 22 did not panic, her gaze did not change in the slightest. She waved her hand and 5 ice pikes appeared floating above her head. With another wave of her hand, the 5 ice pikes shot towards the incoming zombies. With great precision, the 5 ice pikes struck the heads of the 5 zombies that were moving at embarrassingly slow speeds, creating a hole the size of a small fist in the head of each target. However, no blood came out of the wounds as a small layer of ice sealed them. When the rest of the survivors saw this, their expressions changed for the better and their idolatry towards this woman increased several folds immediately. On the other hand, the woman's expression was still as cold and indifferent as ever. From a different direction, another group of survivors was advancing at a rapid pace under the leadership of 2 men. This group had about 30 people, so the strong vital smell attracted many zombies as well as other grotesque creatures that intended to devour them in order to evolve. 2 zombies suddenly appeared from inside a building and staggered towards the survivors. However, before the survivors could even scream in terror, 2 arrows flew and struck the brains of the 2 infected, cutting them lifeless immediately. The survivors looked at the young man holding a bow, wearing sports clothes, and carrying a quiver behind his back, with admiration and envy. This young man ignored them and picked up the 2 arrows he had used before, wiping the blood on them with a rag of torn clothing. Swoosh! Suddenly a mutated dog appeared charging at a speed 3 times faster than a normal person. The big brown dog opened its jaws wide with the intention of biting the young man's head off. With the jaw strength of this level 9 mutated dog, the young man's head would be shattered in a single bite. However, what greeted the dog was a huge hammer. Bang! The dog's head popped off in pieces. The dog's brain matter, blood, and flesh flew everywhere, making a bloody mess. The animal collapsed on the ground completely lifeless. Even if you are fast, if you don't attack me first, you are too weak, stupid dog. A burly man with a beard on his face spat on the dog's corpse. This man looked to be about 35 years old and the expression on his face was savage. He held a metal-colored hammer that was almost as big as a door with his 2 hands, wielding it with apparent ease although it was clearly a heavy weapon. The group continued to advance towards the gymnasium. Of course, Xietain did not know that apart from him, there were other people who had the same idea and the same temporary goal. However, even if he did know, he probably wouldn't be too surprised. After all, the gymnasium was located right in the center of the university campus, so it was accessible from all directions. Moreover, the gymnasium was also one of the few facilities that could be considered comparatively safe. Apart from Xietain, there were other people who also dared to fight or simply had no choice but to fight if they wanted to survive. As a consequence, there were several people who had their own fortuitous experiences, gaining powerful skills and treasures that did not belong to this world. 20 minutes later, and after making several detours to the area in order to find the easiest and least difficult path for the survivors he had saved, Xietain was finally only 50 meters away from the gym and reached his first goal. However, things seemed to be a bit complicated. Student Bai, now what do we do? Jiao asked with a pale face as she watched the scene in front of her. Xietain frowned slightly as he crouched in a corner and saw the dense group of zombies wandering near the gymnasium. There were over 50 zombies, all of them too close together for him to pass. Even for someone like Xietain, it was no easy feat to fight against 50 creatures that could defeat him with just a scratch. If it was in a place where he could move, then Xietain was confident that he could take out a few hundred zombies given enough time. However, fighting 50 of these creatures in such a constricted place was challenging even for him who had been steadily leveling up. What stupefied him most was that these zombies didn't seem to have any intention of leaving.